On the night of April 3rd, 1995, the rain was coming down sideways across the national highway near Durgapur. In the back seat of a car pushing through that storm sat Shekhar Radhakrishna. He was 29 years old, a successful tech founder fresh off negotiating an international partnership, heading home to a wife who was 8 months pregnant. Thousands of miles away, in the remote northeastern hills of India, a woman named Eleanor stood alone in the dark. She was at the edge of an old, overgrown orchard, surrounded by ancient apple and pear trees that had grown far larger than the soil or altitude should have allowed. She had brought a tape recorder, but she wasn't there to document the landscape. For the first time in 5 years, Eleanor was speaking her dead sister's name out loud into the trees. She was confessing an intense, carefully hidden guilt to the ground beneath her feet. These two people had never met. They shared no mutual friends. Yet, as the clock struck 11:51 p.m., a chain of events locked into place that would bind their lives together for the next 30 years. Eleanor finished speaking her sister's name and gave the orchard a single instruction: starve. In an instant, she broke a 50-year cycle of that specific patch of land feeding on human shame. The sudden silence in the orchard caused something ancient to let go. An invisible force, held by the weight of unspoken things, finally released. Traveling instantly at exactly 11:52 p.m., that rippling energy intersected with a single point on the highway, Shekhar's car. There was no physical collision, no other vehicle, but Shekhar's R swerved off the road. He survived the crash, but his consciousness simply stopped. He slipped into a profound coma that would last for 3 full decades. To understand why a tech founder in West Bengal was struck by a geographic anomaly originating in the remote Northeast, we have to look at exactly what was buried beneath that orchard. In the 1940s, a physician named Edmund Hargrove set up a medical mission in those exact northeastern hills. He treated anyone who needed it, until he was killed protecting a village from soldiers. His wife, Catherine, had accidentally revealed Edmund's location to the soldiers to protect other villagers. She survived, but spent years unable to reconcile that he died because she saved others. The villagers gifted her a piece of land above a glacial lake, which she named Checkpoint. Unbeknownst to her, the property's eastern slope was actually an unfinished burial ground, a place where victims of a rapid epidemic were placed decades earlier without proper cultural rites. Catherine planted an orchard over those graves. Every morning for 15 years, she walked into those trees and whispered the details of her guilt. The soil absorbed her pain, and the trees grew dense and massive, feeding on her grief. The local geography was effectively storing a century of human trauma, creating a battery of grief that waited in the soil for someone else to acknowledge it. Eleanor, who was Catherine's granddaughter, arrived at the isolated Checkpoint property in 1995. She was there to research folklore, but she found herself drawn to the same stillness that had haunted her grandmother. She discovered Catherine's hidden diary behind a loose kitchen stone and realized the land was demanding her own buried secret, the guilt she carried regarding the sudden death of her younger sister. When Eleanor yelled her confession into the dark, she starved the ground of its secrets. The ancient roots released their grip, triggering the violent exit of the energy that had been trapped there for generations. Eleanor's act of personal healing inadvertently became the shockwave that struck Shekhar's car on the other side of the country. Following the accident, Shekhar's wife, Sita, refused to let his vision die. For 6 years, she attended every board meeting at his tech company, NovaBridge. She took meticulous notes, ensuring that if Shekhar awoke, he wouldn't return to a blank slate. This chart shows the typical financial projection of the era, mapping the expansion of early software firms. NovaBridge followed this trajectory until 2001. After September 11th, investors pulled out of emerging markets, forcing the founders to close the company. The original team scattered, but their children found each other. They used the early web and online gaming to rebuild the connections their parents had lost. The tragedy that fractured the founders forced their children to build a bond from the ground up. They used daily digital habits to bridge a 30-year gap, creating a connection that ran for years before they finally met in person. On February 17, 2025, after 30 years of total silence, Shekhar's monitors recorded a sudden, sharp spike in neural activity. Shekhar opened his eyes. He had missed the rise of the internet, the growth of his company, and the childhood of his son, Ram. But as his vision cleared, he found his family still waiting at his bedside. Once Shekhar was strong enough to speak, his brother Kiran opened a laptop. He showed Shekhar a photograph of a stone building on a misty hillside. Kiran had spent the last 6 years untangling complex inheritance laws to legally acquire this specific property. The decades of waiting were over. The family was no longer just surviving a tragedy. They were moving to reclaim the ground where it started. The property Kiran purchased was Checkpoint. He didn't know the history of the epidemic dead, but he had managed to buy the exact geographic origin of the shockwave that had derailed his brother's life. The Nova Bridge children, now adults, moved to the site to renovate the stone house. They cleared the trees and built a high-tech museum and resort, physically placing their future on the same ground that had held their parents' past. Behind a stone in the kitchen wall, they found a note that Edmund Hargrove had kept in his pocket. Whoever saves one life, it is as though he has saved all of humanity. The exact plot of Earth that absorbed a century of grief became the foundation that reunited these two families, proving that even the longest timelines can eventually converge toward healing.